Well, good morning, everybody, and we've got probably another few minutes before we hit afternoon. So a little different this year, I guess, where we have multiple sessions go on at lunch in an effort to go ahead and have some social distancing and spread out, as well as go ahead and get as much information out there to all the attendees, since it's been a while since we got together in person. This session today is uncomfortable conversations. And we're going to try and get comfortable with some uncomfortable topics, have some courageous conversations. And while the title may sound a little bit familiar, you know, we don't have Emmanuel Acho coming with us today, but we do have Mr. Mitchell Silver, who is past president of American Planning Association and also president of the AICP Commission. More about Mr. Silver shortly. But one thing that I've come across in the last couple of years that particularly the last couple of years, but probably more than that, several years, is that in a lot of sessions, even during virtual COVID session type years in the last 18 months or so, where you were watching webinars or live sessions on Zoom, a lot of sessions start, or at least a lot of conferences start, with a native land acknowledgement. So, you know, I started thinking about what that's all about, and actually even talked to my son, who's in grad school, said, yeah, no, we have to do those things before we present and before we submit sessions at the college. And so we were like, well, what really is that all about? But regardless, more on that in a minute. We'll start with a land acknowledgement, the area we're here now. And it's a way to acknowledge the indigenous communities and indigenous people, Native Americans, that basically stewarded the land before us. So we want to acknowledge and honor the indigenous communities who lived and took stewardship of the land that we're on today. We recognize that this community was built on the indigenous homelands and resources of the Seminole, Taino, and Tequesta people, as well as their ancestors going back over 10,000 years. We acknowledge the painful history of genocide and forced removal from their territory, and we honor and respect the many diverse indigenous people that are still connected to this land on which we gather on today. This is a call for us to commit to continuing to learn how to better be stewards of the land that we inhabit now. And so while that sounds great, it's a bunch of words and maybe just some platitudes. So again, in talking it over, you know, kids kind of teach you more than you sometimes we're willing to accept. And talking about it with my son, we're like, well, what does it really mean? What does it do anything? Yeah, we acknowledged it. Now what? Kind of like Tom Hanks in Big. I don't get it. So we're going to try and steer you guys into some action. And so, you know, any kind of words without actions, just a lot of empty plans that may as well just sit on shelves. So we're going to try and do something more implementable. And so I'm going to ask you to, you know, to donate to the American Indian College Fund. Because basically, interestingly enough, indigenous communities in this country, of those communities, only about less than 25% have college degrees. And conversely, almost half of the population of those indigenous communities are under 25 years old. So they're in that sweet spot where education could actually make some kind of generational impact for those communities. So a donation here might actually lead to some kind of implementable action rather than just a bunch of platitudes at the beginning of a meeting. And so I encourage you to do that. That'll take you to their website if you're so inclined to donate. And one good thing, again, about words getting turned to action is that in those indigenous communities, what they've shown as far as the students, the youth, even adults that go on to college, almost half of them return back to their native communities to actually work their native communities and make some impact there. So with that, we'll move on to more of the session. Again, this is Uncomfortable Conversations. We're going to get more comfortable with some of these difficult topics that have been burning through our communities, the state, the nation. And again, we have Mr. Mitchell Silver with us today, past president of APA and also president of the AICP Commission. And I am Jim Barnes. I'm the village manager for the Village of Wellington. And we're going to talk about some uncomfortable conversations. And Mitch, do you have a few words you want to share with the group before we get started?
Testing? Okay. I do. Good afternoon, everyone. I know this is a topic about getting comfortable with uncomfortable conversations. I have to say it's probably going to be uncomfortable for you, but also uncomfortable for me. So you all know, I've always, throughout my career, have leaned into the code of ethics. And in that code, it talks about how we really have to pursue social justice and racial and economic integration. That's in there today. We're going through a rewrite, and a lot of people are very concerned about that language being tied to the Black Lives Matter movement, and reminding people it has been in our code for quite a long time. I have spent, as all of you know, my entire life pursuing issues of, we used to call it ethnic diversity, multiculturalism, as far back as the 1990s. And I do just want to give a nod to the person who actually hired me as an intern for my first job, Marilyn Mamano, my first director who hired me way back then. Thank you for being here. That was back in 1985. So I thank you for launching my career. But this is going to be very difficult because I'm going to read to you shortly a statement that I wrote to my staff right after the death of George Floyd. And by the way, earlier that day, there was a gentleman by the name of Christian Cooper who confronted a woman, also last name Cooper, in Central Park. And I'm sure that video went viral. Some of you are aware of it. That was the same day. And later that night, when I saw the George Floyd footage, got quite emotional, and something within me broke. And it took me about a day to write a statement to my staff. My communications commissioner is also a woman of color. We reflected on the statement. I'll read to you that statement. It's raw, but I wanted to share with you my state of mind, because at that point, I felt enough was enough. Number two, I also believe that we have to create a safe space to have these conversations. This is being recorded, so I can't tell you I feel totally safe, but I'm going to have to be vulnerable. As you all know, I speak at a lot of conferences. This one's going to be different, and this is the first time. I won't say I'm nervous, but I don't know what to expect. It'll be unscripted, unplugged, and unpredictable. Jim did share with me the questions. There were so many. It's going to be difficult to get through this session, so I will be bearing my soul and my heart. It'll be my opinion, my reflection. I do not represent, as Bob was saying earlier, the entire Black experience or Black race or people of color, but I'm just going to share with you my experiences growing up of what I went through. And so with that, I'm going to read you this statement, and I do hope I can get through it. But this was at the time, again, this was dated June 1st, 2020. After I put this to our staff, staff wanted me to send it out. I put it on LinkedIn and others, and the reaction was pretty powerful. Dear Parkies, this is a difficult but necessary message to write, compounded by what we've been experiencing during the COVID-19 crisis, isolation, illness, and the loss and grief in real time. We're watching unfold before our very eyes the impact that has stifled rage can have on a community that has experienced generations of systemic racism. Triggered by the recent killings of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, and Breonna Taylor, and the false assault accusations against Christian Cooper across New York City, the state and the country, and around the world, people are rallying together, crying out in despair, demanding change. What we're seeing in our parks and streets are protests with two personalities: peaceful protests and those hijacked by people inciting violence, creating chaos and wreaking havoc. What is unfolding is a direct result of the unleashed pain, anger, and rage one feels having lived in an unjust society, hurt by racism and discrimination. The balance, the worst of it, is inflicted by the same people who are infiltrating to cause more damage. I know what is happening around us is causing many of you the same kind of anguish that is causing me. When issues of race and pain well up, it's like a scab being ripped off, and we are forced to address feelings that were pushed way down inside based on what we've personally experienced and what we've witnessed just to get by. As a Black man and head of an agency, one of my goals is to make sure that New York City Parks is a diverse and safe space for all, that we walk the walk and not just talk, that we protect and respect parkies regardless of your color, creed, gender identity, race, religion, so that we can serve the people of New York, providing them with green spaces where they can cultivate community and enhance their physical and mental health. Because of my role and these occurrences, I am reflecting on my own life experiences and suppressed emotions related to racism, prejudice, and unconscious bias I have faced personally and professionally, and I hope you are too. As you reflect and cope with what is going on in your life and in the world around you, I want you to know that Parks has resources in place to help you address any related concerns. I also want you to know that we'll work and provide other resources and experiences for parkies that will address systemic racism and the resulting repressed rage. I am hopeful that through dialogue and doing, that just like the graffiti damaged property and defaced monuments will be cleaned and repaired, that our emotional scars can be soothed, nurtured, and healed so that we can live equitably. Thank you, and I will see you in the parks. Commissioner.
That was really impactful and moving, Mr. Silver. And, I think just by way of background and context, this is definitely a timely topic. It's an important topic. I start out, again, thanking you for making yourself available, agreeing to do this without really knowing what you're walking into. And we spoke of that initially, and I think you may have thought as we progressed preparing for the session that I'd give you some more information, and I didn't. So not by design, but just the way things worked out. And I think to your point, this is a better discussion had unscripted, unplugged, and sometimes you get more information that way. In terms of why we're here too. Similar moving experience, not as community impactful, but this is more of a personal item as to why I thought the topic was important. And with his permission, this young man who is a class of 2022, a graduate of one of our local high schools in Wellington, where I'm from, wrote this to our government, to our elected officials, to the staff. And I'll read it to you. And again, like I said, with his permission. I started writing this letter as part of my high school virtual community service program in 2020. My name is David Usher, and I attend Palm Beach Central High School. I'm writing to tell you about things that kids my age think about. Last year in 2020, I turned 16 and got my driver's license. At the DMV, I took my photo and registered to vote, but the year was not what I had hoped for. We were in a pandemic and everything seemed wrong. The saddest thing that happened in 2020 is my grandfather passed away in March, and in May, I actually watched a man, George Floyd, being killed by the police. Those two things made me start thinking about life differently. 1 month later, in June, I got my license and a car. I thought I would have more freedom and independence, but after George Floyd tragedy, my parents got super protective and strict because I'm a black teenager living in the suburbs. I have lived in my neighborhood all my life, and there should be no need to worry, but I get it. I believe we need to find a way to build better relationships between young drivers and law enforcement. Our parents should not need to worry about our interactions with the police. We should introduce teenagers that are working hard and doing well in school to the police officers and local public officials in our communities. I always tell my mom she doesn't need to worry, but she always says, I know you're a good kid, but others don't know you, and they don't know that. So I think, why can't you change that? Information about people that break the law is available to police officers, but the police don't know the rest of us. I'm writing this because my parents are always worrying about what will happen if I'm stopped by the police while driving. It would be awesome if the cops would be able to run my plates and know, it's David. He's not a threat to me. I would also know that the officer knows I'm not a threat to him. I think we should have a program where we can apply and register ourselves and our cars at the You Know Me program. Teenage drivers can submit their grade and do a class with local police to get certified. I think people would be surprised that most teenagers do the right thing. The sad thing is that everyone only talks about the kids that are in gangs and get in trouble. Most people don't know that teenagers get stressed out when our parents worry. I don't like when I can't hang out with my friends because my parents are nervous about me going out. My mom worries that most people will look at me and not know what I'm about. I like to listen to music, go out with all my friends, black, white, Hispanic. I'm an honor student with a 3.8 GPA. I run track and cross country. I'm not perfect, but I don't pose a threat to my community. The 2 chapters above were written, this is still part of his letter. The 2 chapters above were written in July 2020, but I never sent it out. Since I started writing this, I was stopped by the police while driving to school for track practice. I was terrified. I may have been going over a little the speed limit, but I know I wasn't driving crazy. All I could think about is keep your hands visible and make sure you make eye contact. I was stopped by an unmarked police car, and that made me even more nervous. Okay, I was terrified. I had to remind myself that this was my neighborhood and not a high-crime area, and I shouldn't worry too much. The officer that stopped me was actually very professional, and I think he saw that I was a scared kid being stopped by the police for the first time. He gave me a warning and left. Although it was a positive outcome, I was too stressed to go to practice that day. I see all the killing of young black men on the news every day for the past year and listen to my parents constantly drilling me about how to survive police interaction. It's a crazy world. It's 2021 and the news cycle has not changed much. All I'm trying to do is go to school, get good grades so I can get a scholarship for college, and have fun on the weekends. All my friends also have cars, and we all drive to and from school, but not all have that extra fear that I have. Please consider the You Know Me program. It could be a good way to build better communities. In less than 2 years, I will vote for the first time. I hope this country will be more united by then. Community policing shouldn't just be a catchphrase. Let's make it part of the driver's license process. That was touching for us from a community perspective, because here you have a 16-year-old kid that has got so many other things to worry about that a lot of us don't have to worry about. And while the program may seem something simple, the fact that the situation is such that they've got to think about, these kids have to think about these outcomes is a problem and troubling, regardless of what community you're from. So things like this at the local level made us feel that this is a conversation that we need to have. We've had different types of community conversations on diversity, equity, and inclusion in our community, and we're hopeful that this is productive for everybody here today. And again, I want to thank Mr. Silver for making himself available and being open and vulnerable, as I hope you all are prepared to do today, for the different questions that we'll try and cover.
And I do want to recognize Sylvia Vargas, newly elected board member, but also one of the co-chairs of the National Diversity Committee for APA. So good to see you. I know this is your home state. Good to see you, Sylvia.
All right, so let's just jump right into it. In terms of, when you think of the term white supremacy, what do you think of?
For me, it's that there are certain whites, and first I want to really congratulate just the audience in this room. This is impressive that we've come a long way and people are now open to hear these conversations. When I hear white supremacy, it's those that believe only whites can be in power and in control at any means necessary. This country was founded by them and for them, and they refuse, as we see demographics changing, to be a minority population. And it's not just happening here in the U.S., it's happening globally. When you look at the white population in the globe, it is a fraction of the global population. And so it is those that believe that I have to remain in power by any means necessary, whether it's voter suppression, whether it's a takeover of the Capitol, that we are white, we're in control, and that is the order that it has to go forward.
Well, related to that, at some point growing up, what's your earliest memory of being aware of racism?
Well, so you all know I'm of mixed race. So growing up, I thought that's just the way it was supposed to be. My father is white. His background is Jewish, although he was not a practicing Jew, and his family migrated from Germany. My mother was black, she passed away, of Haitian descent and Catholic. And so I just thought I got along with myself, black and white. There was no inner turmoil, Catholic, Jewish, it didn't make a difference. So growing up, half my family was white, half my family was black. This is what I thought the world was like. I think it wasn't until I was in, I believe it was in 6th grade, where that's when I started noticing the difference in school. When people were commenting on my father, was he a light-skinned black or was he white? And that's when I realized that people took notice of it. To me, that was just my upbringing. I didn't really see any issue with it. So it was really more toward the 6th, 7th, and 8th grade when one of my friends, so to speak, used the N-word for the first time, and I went home and asked my mother what it meant. And so I did not out him because he was my friend, but that's the first time I realized that some people had some issues with people that had a different skin color.
And that's probably a good jumping off point that, you know, what we see in society today and contemporary with kids, with adults, what have you. Why does there seem to be some kind of extra double standard, a double standard about that black people can say the N-word and white people cannot use it in any way?
Well, I think that's a misunderstanding. Most of my friends and black people I know do not want to use that word, do not want to hear that word. I think there are some people that think it is cool and they don't use ER but A, and that's a term of affection. But most people I know in the black community do not want to hear it from black or white or from any race. So I think this notion that is cool within the black community, I don't use it in our household. Most of my friends do not use it. But I think the few that do, it is kind of exposed as this is the practice in the black community, and that is certainly not the case. Like I said, the majority of the people that I know throughout my entire 60-year life do not want to hear that word, do not want to use that word, but the small majority that do tend to get the focus by some in the media say, see, there are others that feel they can use the word, but whites cannot use it. It is an offensive term. It's used to poke, and so that's why most people that I know prefer not to use that word.
What about the concept of reverse racism?
I've always found that to be a very curious phrase. To exert racism means you have to have power. Maybe there's a small instance where people of color may be in a position of power. For the most part, to me, reverse racism is just a word that people are using to make a point. I do not believe in reverse racism. You have to have the power to change a system. So every time I hear that word, to me, it's just something that people are using just to provoke a conversation, but I do not believe there's anything called reverse racism. People may believe it, but I just don't believe it exists. You need a lot of power to exercise so-called racism.
Well said, I hear you. Well, along some of those lines, what is, you had referenced, growing up in a multiracial household and not really being cognizant, you just thought everybody was that way. What do you think about this concept when you hear a lot of people talk, a lot of white people who many times are, progressive white folks, and I'm sure we have this whole room is loaded with progressive white folks, but a lot of times, sometimes progressive white people are the most dangerous people to come across. When people talk about colorblindness, what's your reaction when you hear that? Oh, I'm colorblind and I don't see color.
I mean, I do believe that some people are sincere about that. A lot of people I've come across that I've befriended over the years do not see race as an issue and really want to get to know the individual. So I do believe there are some, when they say that they're colorblind, I do believe that. I think there are others that are trying to say it to make you feel comfortable, or you always are afraid when someone says, I have a black friend, that doesn't give you a pass. But I do believe that some people are sincere. But I also agree with you that, a place like New York that's supposed to be so progressive, you start getting to some school board issues and some school changes in testing scores, and you'll see that colorblindness dissipate rather quickly when it comes to their children. So I take people at their word, and I do believe that there are some that truly believe that they are colorblind and show that in their values and mannerisms, but there are others say it to be, I think, politically correct. But then everyone has a line, and when you cross that line, you'll see how different their behavior changes.
Let's talk a little bit about white privilege or white advantage, and specifically how you might see that, one, just in context, and really how you see that and how it relates to equity.
Well, I first want to give my definition of equity, diversity, inclusion, because I know there's these long definitions. I have a working definition of those you heard me present. I'm going to say it. I make it simple. Equity means fairness. Diversity is the value of different perspectives. Inclusion means to be welcoming to all. So that if I come into a space or place, I want to be able to say, I feel welcome, I belong here. That, to me, is the test, so that's the definition I use. I think most people don't realize their white privilege. I think there are some that are beginning to understand it. And it's hard to communicate because unless you're in a situation where if you walk into a store and you're being followed, or a woman clutches her purse, or you're questioned very differently about something, it's hard to understand what white privilege is. I'll give you just one example. Very recently, someone asked us to talk about how we felt, in New York City after the whole Black Lives Matter movement. This is a high level with City Hall folks, and none of us wanted to share. None of us wanted to share because we knew that if we said something, it would put us in a very vulnerable and awkward position. And so some people did offer some questions. People got very defensive who were white. And now I said, now it's going to be uncomfortable in every conversation we have because these questions were really deep and rough. But from a white privilege perspective, you can now walk into that space and don't feel the discomfort that we feel. Or that if you go to a job, that I have to check my black identity at the door because there are things I cannot say. Whites don't have to do that. Or even now, I left as a commissioner, now I'm in the private sector. I want to speak out about issues of race. But now I work for an employer who is in the private sector with clients. But white privilege doesn't have to worry about those concerns. But people of color do. And so now I'm going back into a space where I'll have to somewhat be guarded. Not that I want to, it's because I want to make sure I don't really hurt the company in any way. So it puts me in a very awkward position that I know whites with their privilege may not feel that. So I believe most people who are white don't understand their white privilege, of how they can go into a space and not be looked upon or questioned, or their intelligence, their IQ. If you got a job, do you do it based on your qualifications? So it's something that I'm hoping more and more people will talk more about. And I know there are several books that are now talking about white privilege. But it's something I certainly encourage all of you to look into because it can be painful for us that do not have the privilege that you have. Or even applying for a mortgage. I'm now having a house built in North Carolina. They asked me to put down my race. I didn't put it down, because I got denied a mortgage, my first house, and for a reason that they wouldn't even disclose. And so these are some of the things we have to deal with that, in my opinion, a lot of whites do not have to deal with based upon their privilege.
Well, you mentioned something in that discussion about checking your blackness at the door. Do you find that, I guess over the course of your career, do you find that that's something that happens more frequently than not, or do you find yourself having to code switch, if you will,
Before
on a
George
regular
Floyd,
basis?
I code switched all the time, and I had to. What was liberating about the incident with George Floyd is I really congratulate the young people for really elevating the conversation, demanding change that I hadn't seen, and I was born in the 60s. And it was liberating because I did have to suppress it all my life. And it gave me the opportunity now to actually be myself, a black man, as a commissioner in America, to express myself in a very different way. And it was liberating. The conversations we were able to have with my staff, the things we were able to do in New York City. As a person, we talk about diversity to represent. I don't just want to represent. I want to have the power to change. And so I immediately pivoted in New York City to start changing and renaming spaces to reflect the black experience. That was something I always wanted to do, but this whole movement allowed me to say and do things I didn't normally do. As a commissioner, it was the first time I was protesting, and they were shocked. I'm out there, I'm a runner, so we had running protests. I'm out there running, protesting, saying, you are a commissioner. I'm seeing the police all over the place, and I'm at the podium saying, hi, I'm the commissioner of parks, and all the NYPD are like saying, oh my God. It felt liberating because I knew and understood what happened to my two sons, who were both black. I could not be there to help them about what happened to them. And so for me to say it was enough is enough, it was so liberating that I did not have to check my black identity at the door anymore and no longer had to code switch. So for those of you who know code switch, you basically act one way for blacks, you act another way for whites, you try to blend in, you don't want to be offensive, you don't want to say the wrong thing, and it's a burden. That's another thing about white privilege. You don't have to do that. You don't have to do that, but we do because we don't want to offend or make people uncomfortable. So we will say and do things to make sure that we progress in the organization. We want to be able, there's certain things we can't say for fear of retribution, that we won't be promoted in an organization. And so a lot of that code switching goes on. And I'm very pleased that as a result of the whole Black Lives Matter, George Floyd incident, that I'm able now to be more of myself and speak out. But I have to tell you, to know I suppressed it for my entire life was painful. Painful to know that I had to keep that in and I didn't feel safe or free to express myself. And so the one thing I'm going to say is that for all of you, when I did it in my office, we created a safe space. After I wrote that piece, we had a reflections with my black staff first, then we brought it to other staff to create a space where people could talk about how they really felt. And we talk about allies, they kept saying, what can we do? That is the wrong question. You have to first ask people, how do you feel? You just witnessed a person being murdered on television, crying out to his mother as being transitioned to greet her. It's not what can I do, that comes later. The first question is, how do I feel? So we had those conversations with our staff, and what I heard was so powerful. And that's important that when these things happen. So now, I remember there was one woman that wrote an article right after the George Floyd murder, and she said she had a deadline, and she said, I just witnessed a man being murdered, and you're asking me about a deadline? Aren't you going to ask? I'm grieving. I can't focus. I can't concentrate. My life is just torn apart. So I think, now people are willing to speak out. More offices are now willing to acknowledge, for example, the Juneteenth as a national holiday and now a city holiday. But more importantly, the reflections, how do I feel before you jump to what can I do? That comes later.
Again, really impactful stuff. I think that's something that not a lot of us really had a concept about. You ask people how they're doing on a passing basis, not expecting somebody's going to really tell you what they feel now. And that's probably something we all need to be more prepared for and acknowledge that we do need to ask people how they're doing,
right,
how they're relating. But you talked about, as far as being allies and how that relates to, in terms of, before you ask somebody, what can I do? How do you feel? But assuming you go past that point and you do try and figure out how best to be an ally, what is an ally to you? And then what does that support look like from an ally?
Well, one, I know there are people out there, it's protesting, it's understanding the cause, it's speaking out, it's recognizing what needs to be done. It's not just hiring a diversity officer, but having the leadership team be the diversity office. We just kind of assign someone saying, oh, we have a diversity officer, let's check the box. No, the board needs to be the diversity office. The leadership team needs to be the diversity office, because if you delegate it to one person, job's done, that person will just tell us what to do. So to me, diversity, equity, inclusion is not something you do. It's who you are. These are values you have to accept within you. If I say let's have a campaign on kindness, unless you understand what kindness is, it has to be authentic and come from a real place. Diversity, equity, inclusion is something that who you are, not what you do. And if you're an ally, it's going to take some time to understand exactly how to absorb that as a value. As commissioner, as a person, I look through everything through that lens. For example, let's just take the word loitering. Believe it or not, in New York City, we had signs in our parks that said you could not loiter. Now, private property, I understand, but in a public park, it said you could not loiter. Now, the word loitering means to sit or stand idly by with no apparent purpose. Newsflash, that's what you do in a park. But if it's a nice white couple sitting on a bench, look at them, they look so adorable, enjoying the green space. But if it's 5 black or brown teenagers, excuse me, there's someone that does not belong here. You can racialize that to inflict pain on someone. But because my lens is always looking for this injustice and inequity, that for me it came right away. Diversity and equity inclusion is not something you do, it's who you are, because you look at things with a very different lens. The good news is in 2017, we changed the rule. You could now loiter in New York City parks. We went a step further. During the year of COVID, we launched an art project called the Yes Loitering Project to reach out to teenagers to make sure that they feel welcome in our public spaces, and how rules make them feel excluded. Because young teenagers, particularly black and brown, they are scary, scary, scary to the general public. And so we had to reach out to make sure we embrace them. So to me, when we talk about don't just hire a diversity officer, it has to be a leadership, accepted, and you don't just talk the talk, you have to walk the walk. And so that, for me, from my perspective, if you want to be an ally, you have to understand that principle first.
In your position as the Parks Commissioner in New York City, you certainly made yourself vulnerable and reached out to your staff and tried to care for your staff that maybe in some cases were feeling a bit neglected based on everything that was going on. But what do you do to take care of yourself in the long haul? What are you doing? And to be more succinct.
Well, let me just.
How are you doing, Mitch?
Not well, I'll be honest with you. I think the combination, so in New York City, parks employees, we had to go to work. We're considered essential workers, had to go there from day one. And so there was a lot of fear. People were afraid. It's like, it wasn't just being in the parks that were outdoors, it was taking public transportation. And it was scary, scary, scary. But we knew in New York City, our parks became our sanctuaries of sanity. It was the only thing open. Only. Bowling alleys, movie theaters, restaurant, everything was closed but parks. And they had to come to work. And so for them, it was a scary time. I'm sorry, I just lost my train of thought there for a second. After worrying about staff, I would write condolence letters, either a staff member to their family passed away of COVID or a family member. I'll never forget one letter I wrote, because I write condolence letters to anyone for anything that happened. One letter, I said, I'm sorry for your beloved aunt, your uncle, and your 4 cousins who passed away of COVID. A whole house. I was so focused on taking care of staff, taking care of my senior leadership, taking care of my family, I forgot about myself. And by the summer, by August, COVID, the racial and social unrest, I broke. And so fortunately, I reached out and we got the Department of Mental Health, had these self-care classes, and we held it for our staff, and all of us just broke down because we were so concerned about everyone else, we forgot about ourselves. In that one, it was the first time I understood. She talked about stress, trauma, and anxiety. Stress and anxiety is okay if you have to do a paper, it's natural, but long-term stress and anxiety produces trauma. And that's what people were going through during COVID and then the civil and social unrest. And I thought to myself, wait a minute, we've been dealing with this for a year and a half. What about those people in poverty that have been living through generational trauma and how they react? People say, look, they're criminals, they do this. This is generational trauma of being suppressed and isolated and put down and not giving opportunity and blaming the victim for the places they live, when actually, if you look at the history of the United States, racism was baked into the American system, yet we're blaming the victim. Look at that ghetto. It's their fault. Look at the crime. It's a horrible area. They weren't allowed to go anywhere. And so it started, one, to understand the importance of self-care and lead into our parks and open spaces. We started changing our focus, and I told all our leadership staff, you've got to take care of yourself, because we had a whole chart of the effect of long-term stress and anxiety. It talks about alcoholism, anger, isolation. I mean, we have a whole list. And so I started on the track of saying, I have to be more focused to make sure I'm there for my staff, my family, and everyone else. But it was 2020 was a very difficult year. And so I just want all of you to take stock. I do have a presentation I give on all this stuff, maybe another time, but do take care of yourselves, because it's not just you, it's your community, it's your family, it's your office, and it's you. We all went through this the past year and a half. Those of us that dealt with a kind of systemic and social injustice had a little bit extra layered onto it. But for me, August of last year was a breaking point for me, and I'm glad, because that was a breakthrough, because I understood the importance of self-care.
That's important. How do I assume that you're...
This is hard, by the way. This is really, I feel like I'm in a therapy session with like 100 people. Please forgive me. This is not easy. All right. Thank you.
Thank you again. So we'll keep going. And I'm not making light of the situation.
You should have brought a couch. I mean, it would have made it a lot easier.
Well, I did ask Alex if we could have some easy chairs in the front, because this makes it a little less personal if we're not...
I know there's group therapy, but it's a little bit different. All right.
But,
thank you.
So I assume you had a fairly diverse staff at the Parks Commission. What's one way, or maybe different ways, that you've in the past or currently connect with people, white people, who have differing views about race than you do?
Well, I'm going to go back to when I was planning director in North Carolina. And when I went there, I noticed that we had black planners, we had Hispanic planners, white planners, and, black planner was assigned to the black neighborhood, and Hispanic planner, Hispanic neighborhood, I decided to rotate the staff, because I wanted my staff and the community to have different experiences engaging different employers and staff members. And that was very helpful. So that was one technique, because I know the Black planner wanted to work in the Black community, but I felt in order for them to get a better experience of the issues in different neighborhoods, I started to rotate them so they got experience of working in different places. The other one is that I think if you, in a more informal setting like this one, I'm proud of all of you that were able to have this conversation, that if there's an opportunity to have an open conversation, whether it's comfortable or uncomfortable, to me it's good to kind of hear these stories. Like I said, don't say what I can do, but ask how do I feel. That is one way of starting to hear, the impact of what you're doing, the impact of what you're saying, the impact of some of your policies, because most people don't know. I have to tell you, when I read The Color of Law, I was so angry, not because of what was in the book. I never read that book in planning school. That book did not exist. And now everyone's reading it and going, oh my God. And I felt somewhat betrayed, because I'm saying, wait a minute, I went to planning school and all this was omitted. I had know a little, but didn't know how much racism was baked in to the New Deal and everything that followed, all the stuff I revered that made America great. I'm like, oh my goodness, from day one, restrictive covenants and, redlining. And I knew about those things, but reading the book was really an eye-opener. So I think having a conversation about that book, Caste, and other books, to me is the beginning of a conversation, a dialogue to show how whites have been at a real advantage of building wealth over the years, while people of color just were not able to do that. So I think having conversations, whether it's a book club based upon those books, to me is a great opportunity to start finding a path forward.
In the course again of your career, have you ever found yourself, and I understand this might be a little bit more sensitive, but have you ever found yourself present when somebody, a white person, said or did something racist, and did you find yourself, because of the situation, because of your position, in a place where you did not say something or you stood back?
I would usually say something diplomatic, but I remember there was this one joke at a party that I regret not saying something, and it was a joke that just pissed me off, and I said, what's the most confusing day in Harlem? And the answer was Father's Day. I was so shocked, I didn't know how to react. But I think in public settings where something is stated, I'll be a little bit more diplomatic, but I won't let it slide. But I think now, because I have a position of stature, I'm well respected, I can say it in such a way it will be well received. But I think a younger person probably would not be able to say it and say there's an angry black man, an angry black woman, and then they would be targeted in some way, or typecast or stereotyped. But the answer is, in public settings, I will say something, but in a situation like that, it was at a more informal function that made me so angry I didn't even know how to respond.
Well, let's dig into that a little bit more. What you hear a lot of times in a lot of situations is you have a lot of white people that basically will focus on the broken black family and the lack of black fathers, and the contention that isn't that the biggest contributing factor to the lack of success for black people. And what would you say to that, particularly given your prior comment?
Well, that's systemic racism. It's all built into the system. For someone to succeed, I have to actually nod my head. I don't know how many of you know my story, but it was not easy. Mother died when I was young, high school dropout. When I applied for my first college, they actually looked at me and said, "You're not college material." That's what they said during the interview. "You're not college material." Luckily, I got a GED. I earned a scholarship from my guardian angel, who happened to just be standing there after I left the interview. Went on to grad school, but no one knew that I was a college dropout, and what I had to endure and go through to graduate probably made me stronger, but that's not a path I would want most people to take. It is so hard. It's stacked against you wherever you turn. We have to work twice as hard, twice as long, and even then when you go for a job, you're deemed not to be qualified. And to be honest with you, I tell my staff when you're hiring, being a person of color is a qualification. Because we have to work so hard, twice as hard, to get to somewhere. Those life experiences matter. And so that's something I shared. But the system is just stacked up. Everything you mentioned, racism is real, and it's going to take generations to undo it. I'm optimistic about what's happening. I'm optimistic about who's sitting here in this room. And I'm encouraged that as we look at demographic change, those white supremacists, I'm optimistic, are going to get old and eventually die off, and we'll be left with a lot more open-minded, younger people, and that's my hope about future generations. Because if you'll recall, about 10 years ago, I don't know if you remember all this, when I share with you, first time in APA open setting, I remember it was in 2012, we talked about, it was the changing faces of America, and I remember the first time I started talking about America becoming a minority race by the 2040s. I remember people walking out the room screaming at me, "You're lying." I knew then that we were really headed toward a very uncomfortable and dangerous future. I then said that the 2020s is going to be a clash of value. It actually started 2016, 2017, when whites realized that one day they would be a minority. I was getting very concerned about what that was going to look like. The only saving grace was that the younger generations were more open, more tolerant. So we're going to have to ride this wave, but I hate to say it's going to get worse before it gets better. We're in tribal, divisive politics, and to me, it's not voter suppression, it's cheating. Let's stop calling it voter suppression. It's cheating because we can't win by normal means, and this is all a result by people getting uncomfortable about the change of race as we move into the 2020s and 2030s. We're going to have to be strong. We can endure it, because I do believe we're a strong country, and so I'm optimistic about the future, but it's going to get worse before it gets better.
Along the lines of people getting uncomfortable with the changing landscape, and white people in particular, why is it that, at least a perception, if not reality, that black, indigenous, or other people of color seem to, at least the contention is out there, that care more about white on black crime than black on black crime? Is there anything to that?
No, if you come to any inner city, there are so many groups that are fighting against black on black crime. You know, I'm very concerned because of the situation in some of our communities. Young people do not have a purpose, and because they don't have a purpose, they're filling it in by a variety of different ways. And unfortunately, pride and stature in the community, you know, you have to do things that are quite unfortunate. But we have people speaking out against all crime. And I know how people lean into, what about the black on black crime? It does exist. The white on black on white crime exists. But all crime should not be tolerated. All violence should not be tolerated. But I would not hold it up to say, look, they're hurting one another, because there are very different dynamics and circumstances, lack of opportunities. I can go on and on. I'm not making excuses for it, but no one should tolerate violence, whether it's black on black or white on black, period.
Well, as a follow-up to that, what led to a lot of local issues related to post the murder of George Floyd is that you had communities that otherwise never had to confront issues related to racism, issues related to racial unrest, starting to think about it. And can you spend some time talking about, you know, the typical conversation that happens at coffee cooler talk at the offices and then neighborhoods, and is that, why does it have to be Black Lives Matters and not All Lives Matters?
All lives matter, there's no question. The point of Black Lives Matter and watching what was going on specifically to lives after it was televised and after televised, people were just saying enough was enough. And they're saying it is time, after 400 years of suppression, slavery, racism, that it was time to do something about it. Enough was enough. After George Floyd, there's a man in Minnesota shot in his car. I mean, it was situation after situation, you know, of what happened here in Florida. It just became a tipping point. We all agree all lives matter, but felt that we don't want to dilute it because we have a specific problem in America when it comes to black lives. And so collectively, people wanted to elevate that conversation to say it is time to do something about it. Let's not kind of smooth it over by saying all lives. We have to pay specific attention of what had happened in this country for 400 years.
How does it become blurred, or I guess what is a way to not blur the lines where you have many people that will go ahead and contend that, you know, while they understand protesting and what protesting can accomplish, they question why so many black or other people of color and their allies are rioting?
That was another, I think, issue elevated by the press. In New York City were 2 days of riots, and these were young people on bikes and motorcycles and city bikes crashing, and of course they hijacked, the early part of the Black Lives protest. But that is a fraction of what went on. There are still protests going on in New York, 18 months later. The protests happened, I think, 2 days right after George Floyd's death. Yet that seems to get a lot of the attention. So rioting is unacceptable. Rioting is not tolerated. These were a lot of locally owned businesses that were destroyed and damaged. And everyone in the community said this is unacceptable, but unfortunately there were some that were opportunistic, that just wanted to get some stuff and loot, and it wasn't rioting per se, but they just wanted to be able just to loot, not riot, and I think they got far too much attention. But the vast majority, like I said, I'm part of a running protest group, a co-captain. It is peaceful. We didn't just do Black Lives Matter. We did the AAPI as well. We joined forces together to show that Black Lives Matter, AAIP Lives Matter. We were all one happy family because of what was going on with the AAPI community following some events last year. So again, the rioting is unfortunate. It was a fraction of what went on, but the vast majority that I see, both here and across the country, are peaceful protests.
Going back a little bit in terms of, I think it was probably around around the time where it was at the New Orleans APA National Conference a few years back, or in that time frame, and maybe a year before, actually even and going back as back as to the 2012 LA conference, where a lot of going on, and now we've resumed it again, related to white supremacy, Confederate heritage, and that type of thing. From a planning standpoint, because it certainly got a lot of attention from planners at that conference, what do you think about people either advocating keeping or not keeping Confederate monuments, or adding, explanation cards to them and that type of thing? And how does that compare to what some folks would say that you're honoring the oppressor?
My thinking has evolved on this. It was more of a statue in Central Park, but it was Marion J. Sims, who was a doctor who operated on enslaved women without their consent. And so I felt for that statue there should have been an explanation. We ended up removing that statue. I do believe that they should be removed. Cities are layers of history, and I think that it was at a time where one message is being sent, but I do support whether the Confederate statues or flags. It is painful and hurtful that I think it is time for us to revisit. But I'm not saying it's across the board. We're now debating Christopher Columbus, Theodore Roosevelt statue in New York. But I do support the removal of some of those statues because of the painful memories it inflicts on people who lived both today or their ancestors that lived while it was actually going on.
On something maybe less serious but equally as important, as we continue to look at confronting this country's legacy of slavery, of oppression, something as routine as national team names that have mascot team changes due to the fact that you've got a potential racial slur in their team name. Where are you on that topic?
Yeah, change it. I mean, they're all doing it right now. The Indians, the Washington Football Club, it's now happening. Like I said, we evolve. We evolve over time. We have to be respectful with the change of time. So I do support the changing of those mascots or songs or anything that is offensive. If I'm doing something that's offensive, I want to reconsider and change that behavior as well. But I do believe part of growing as a nation, we're becoming more diverse. We have to be more sensitive to these issues and willing to change because we know a lot more now than we knew yesterday. So I'm totally okay with the changing of the names. Did the Washington team ever get a name yet, or are they still just a football club?
I think it's still...
Oh, the football team? That's the baseball team. I think they're still the Washington Football Club.
Yeah. And so, a topic that has gotten a lot of airtime over the last couple of years. Let's talk about defunding the police and that whole concept. And is your position on that somewhat colored by your interaction with police in the past, or in your professional or personal life?
Yeah.
Or, and as an add-on to that, if you could cover, have you had any personal interaction with law enforcement that you think maybe could have been handled by somebody that might have been in a different agency rather than law enforcement?
I'll take the last part last, because there were a couple of instances. Well, let me do well, first, I do not support the phrase of defund the police. I want to be protected. I support the police. Are there bad police out there that need to be removed from the force? Yes. Should there be police reform? Yes. Should they change some of their practices about when they feel that they're in danger and they can use deadly force? Yes. But I do not believe in defund the police. What was interesting is there was this debate right after it happened where you have the younger generation that was, you defund the police, and the older generation is saying, no, there should be police reform. They says, you're not down with Black Lives Matter unless you defund the police. That became the litmus test, like saying, no, we don't support that. We want police protection. The vast majority of the police are good, law-abiding citizens who care about protecting the public. So, no, I do not support the defund the police. I do support police reform, as I stated. So, having said that, that is still somewhat, I think it's calmed down a bit, but that was very contentious when you had a split between the younger and older generations of blacks. Younger saying defund the police, the older ones saying not down with that, let's look for some police reform. Yes, I've had instances with the police to this very day. I am terrified when I'm on a highway and I see those lights. Now, as a commissioner, I had a shield. I kept it with me, put it right on my seat, so in case I'm stopped, they'll see the shield. I don't have the shield anymore. When I was stopped several times, one time I was wearing a winter coat and I couldn't get to my wallet. I opened the car door and a police officer slammed the door on my leg that was outside the door and got a pretty substantial bruise. Another time when I was young, a friend of mine, an idiot, we were on Flatbush Avenue. He threw a firecracker at a guy that was leaned over. Little did we know he was an undercover cop. We were walking back to his house. The police car started pulling in there, grabbed us, literally ripped our shirts to where the buttons were just stuck on the other side, ripped it straight down, threw us up against the wall. Now, I'm not saying it was just, my friend should not have thrown a firecracker at this person, but I guess it was some kind of a sting. Those were probably the other ones, got stopped many times, and so I'm always nervous because I don't know what to do. I don't know what to do not to get shot. Do I put my hands up? Do I reach? Where do I put my, my papers? I don't know what to do. So to this day, I am still terrified, but there were at least 3 instances where I had a not so pleasant situation. My son's a different story, and I don't feel comfortable saying what happened. But I can tell you one of them, his life is ruined as a result of what happened with an interaction with police. And I don't want to say anything beyond that because it's personal. Those are my sons. But so that's why I'm saying that I could not be there to rescue them, tried to warn them about how they have to be with and confront the police. But unfortunately, it didn't turn out that well. And that's something that both him and I will have to deal with for as long as he lives.
Related to issues.
This is really being taped, right? Oh, Lord Jesus.
There's something that may be a little bit lighter, but not still all this stuff is serious stuff. As you interact throughout your professional and personal life with other folks, and certainly you've seen or at least heard about people and cultural appropriation, and have you personally maybe appropriated another culture yourself? And where do you draw the line personally between that cultural appreciation and cultural appropriation?
I lean to cultural appreciation, and I think that is something important to do. I think it makes us better Americans, have an appreciation of the different cultures. I love cities that appreciate the culture and reflect it and talk about it. So I prefer to lean into cultural appreciation, in my opinion, than a cultural appropriation. I think traditions and culture are very unique to different ethnic identities, and so I just like to lean into cultural appreciation.
Okay. I think we go till about 1 o'clock. We're getting close. What I'd like to do is maybe, but we're not finished yet.
I didn't want this all to be about me. I saw the questions, but let me just pause here for a second to say I am so optimistic about planners. To look out in this room, my heart is warm because when you look at the code of ethics of engineers, of landscape architects, of architects. Ours is unique, and it talks about the principles we aspire to be, and to look around this room. You didn't have to be here. And I didn't know what to expect. You didn't know what to expect. So I want to applaud all of you for just being here to listen, because to me, that's just the beginning. I didn't know what to expect, and I'm sure you'll take away some nuggets. So I personally want to thank you just for being here. This is not, mandatory credit, so you're all here voluntarily. So I'm just saying that seeing all of you gives me hope that we're all moving in the right direction.
That's great, but we're not done yet. And Bob, I hope that he's going to be getting some questions from the crowd, but we'll do something really quick before the first question happens there. And,
Can I have? I don't drink before 6, but I may make an exception. Anybody wants to join me?
I'm going to show Mr. Silver a little bit of love. And basically, the reason I reached out to him was because in 2012, in that session you referenced, I think one of the things that you left us with, in addition to all the data that some people were pissed off about, was you said, you kind of got us to think about falling in love with planning again. And I'm not going to get sentimental, but that was touching, and it struck a chord. So while I don't think we're going to have something today that's going to be falling in love with planning again, hopefully, Mr. Silver's words and thoughts and personal sharing of his issues and situations was helpful. But today, one thing to think about is, the reason we're all here, the reason, it's easy to figure out. You're a transportation planner, you work on transit and stuff like that. You're a land use planner, you do some comp plans, you do some land use plans and that kind of thing. It's easy to figure out what you do and how you do it. But usually to be able to get that what better is to figure out your why. So let's take a quick look at this.
So you're a musical director. Cool.
Yes, sir.
All right, so let me get a couple bars of like Amazing Grace. Can you do the first part of that? Go ahead.
Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me.
Wow. That bro could sing, you know what I'm saying? All right. Now, what you give me the version is if your uncle just got out of jail, you got shot in the back when you was a kid. I'm just saying, let me see the hood version real quick, if you know which version I'm talking about. Just see if that exists. Let me see what you got.
Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me.
It's a slow build, Bob. There's a reason we're doing this.
Right now I'm found, was blind, but now I see.
Let's go. Now. Okay.
So basically, he could sing. He definitely could sing. But when he knew why he was singing, it brought out really what he could do. So it's important when we walk out of here today, we can all do the same crap we do every day. We're doing plans, doing some governmental representation, getting some permits, making developers some money. But when you figure out your why, you're actually going to probably be able to do your what a whole lot better, and ultimately serve the communities that we're supposed to serve, where we're actually answering to a higher authority. We're not registered with the state. We have AICP, and we really answer to ourselves and somebody else. And that's what you need to do. So with that, Bob, I will leave it to you to find some questions, and hopefully Mr. Silver will have more answers.
Okay, remember, therapy session's over, so let's see.
No, you got to turn it on. Flip it up.
Okay.
There you go.
I'm talking button challenge, I guess. I just want to get your take on the media. Through all this Black Lives Matter and all the things that we hear day in and day out, we get bombarded by this entity or that entity. And I just wanted to get your thoughts on how does the media influence us and how do we decipher all that as we go through time?
Yeah, media does influence, and I have to say that if you look at media, there are now multiple sources that some have a political focus. Social media has changed the game entirely. It's like we're hurling things at each other at a rapid pace, and it's unfortunate. So both the media and the social media play a major role. Now, as commissioner, I have to tell you, I dealt with the media all the time. I'd finish an interview and had my staff there, and I'm saying, didn't we just give them all these facts? Yet they're storytellers. They always say, next, this story, it's a story, it's not fact. And so a lot of people will read or watch the media assuming it's fact because they have pictures. But I can tell you firsthand, I just had all my staff go through an interview, and the information that's being reported is not exactly accurate. So there are some that have a point of view they want to share. And so we have to be very smart and very savvy at looking at multiple sources and not just rely on one source if you truly want to get the fact. But early on, I even told my wife when they were taking pictures of just the riots, yet I lived in New York City, everything I saw was peaceful. There was a riot here or there, but that became the piece that the media focused on when it was not accurate. And so people believe what they see, and so it perpetuates something that is simply not true. So be wise. I actually stopped watching the news because during COVID, I didn't need that other mental anguish, so I just shut it off and relied on more softer stuff like, the digital newspapers of sources I trust, and then folks in social media who I also trust.
All right. Hi, Mitch. Okay, my question is actually bringing this back to sort of the individual level, one-on-one. One of the biggest fears I often have, I think of myself as a progressive ally, but I probably should know better because I'm sure that there are some deep-seated issues that I may have and carry on. My biggest fear is accidentally saying the wrong thing or saying something that I intend to say the right thing, but it comes off as the wrong thing. Either it is bringing up a topic of race or asking a question about a family recipe or some other thing, or even revealing something about myself. What is, and I don't want to put you on the spot alone, Mitch, because I know you're on the spot enough already today, but what, if anything, are some general guidance on helping people who do want to be allies be without putting our foot in our mouth?
I'll always preface, because the same thing, I'm now, there was a point in time about 2 years ago, I was trying to understand him, her, hers, and I was like, folks, look, I get it. Please, I don't want to be insensitive. Help me out. So if I say something wrong, help me grow and learn. It's the same thing. If you're sincere about it and saying, look, I want to have this conversation, I don't want to say the wrong thing, help me that as we have this conversation, if there's something I say that's offensive or not accurate, help educate me so when I talk to other people of color, I won't make that same mistake. Because I went through that. I mean, our staff went through we had to do the pronouns, there was whole debate, we had 31 options, I had to sit there and learn, and I said, I am so confused, and so, but as we had this conversation, I had to preface it by saying, I support your gender identity and using pronouns, but help me get educated, and if I say the wrong thing, walk me through this. So it's the same thing as you have a conversation about fear of saying the wrong thing, but someone will always know when you're sincere. They can just see it. People are a very good judge of character, and if you're sincere and authentic, I think you will be able to get through that and not have that fear of offending.
I'll add one quick footnote to that before Jill's question, is that, if you screw it up, just own it. Own it and move on. I mean, I rogered that one pretty good. Let me go ahead and try and figure out. And the other thing is, too, quite frankly, you need to really commit to doing the learning. Don't just put it on, your black friends or your LGBTQ friends or anybody else that's going to kind of take you through this process. It's not on them to educate you. You've got to learn the stuff, but be willing to be wrong. And if you're wrong, just own it and move on. And don't make the same mistake again. So, Jill?
Thank you both for doing this session. This is actually a question I had from our earlier session that I didn't get to ask, and I'm glad I can ask Mr. Silver this also. So I have several close friends who, I don't know if it's they're unwilling or unable to step outside of their experience. So they don't believe in white privilege. They don't believe in systemic race. And, Jim, I take the point that you made during our session very strongly that, we need to stand up and we need to interrupt bias. But I don't know how to do it with someone who is so unwilling or unable to step out of their experience. And I'm just wondering if anybody has suggestions for that.
I'm not sure there's anything you can do. I think it is for a person that does not understand, for whatever reason, does not want to understand. I don't know if it's for fear, upbringing, context, whatever it is so obvious that if someone does not want to talk about it, believe it, to me, there has to be something else a lot deeper. So I just walk away. Right now, we're in a country where our politics and our country is so tribal. I'm trying to be very diplomatic about what occurred the last 5 or 6 years, but we're at a very scary point in our country, and facts don't matter. Experience doesn't matter. And so, as I said, I'm hopeful that as we look to the younger generations that think very differently, that I have hope for the future. And those attitudes that are so troubling this country, look, we're not going to live forever, but I'm hoping that as they die off, we will see a fresh awakening in this country that'll embrace the rich, beautiful diversity that made this country what it is.
Hi, I'm Tia Maxwell. I had a question specifically, I guess, for people of color. When we don't have consensus on some of the ideas that you expressed today, specifically relating to our experience and what we look towards in the future, how do we contend with that, specifically when people or non-people of color, white people in general, are looking to us for answers and we don't come to a consensus on what those answers are? And then how do we also create spaces for camaraderie?
Well, I certainly believe in creating safe spaces. That is a hard thing to do. I think it comes from the leadership and the top. But you pose a very good question. I don't have all the answers, but like I said, to me, it starts with listening. To me, when I talk about communication skills with our staff, it's not speaking to the public, but it's listening. So I think as you listen, you hear the need. As you listen, you get a better understanding. So, but to me, the critical part is about a safe space. I feel betrayed that if I share something and then someone shares it in confidence, that's painful because the pain is deep and real. So I think as you create those safe spaces, whether it's people of color, gay, queer, lesbian, whatever it may be, you want to be able to share how you feel, to be vulnerable and not that being betrayed and taken advantage of. And I think in that listening, if we're committed to making change, I do believe we'll find a path forward. But that does take courage. It takes a lot of courage. Like today, I was very nervous coming in because I knew I'd have to share things I did not want to share. But I trust among the APA planning family that I'm just going to assume that this is a safe space. And I'm hopeful that these conversations will continue.
One last. Thank you. I'll try to be quick. My name is Dana Riddell, and I have... we all share different experiences, and I, too, try to be an ally of Black Lives Matter, of the cause of equality, and I've been in conversations where I'm trying to explain the systemic oppression of the Black community, voting, and how throughout time there's been so much oppression. And so many people have said, well, I'm white, and I don't have a dad, or I'm white, and I know this person's dad is in jail. Can you, if you don't mind, expand a little bit on the importance of, why it's so important that we have Black fathers in our community and why it's so damaging, or it can be so damaging for cultures as a whole to be missing their fathers.
Wow. Okay. This is deep and complicated, but I think if you go back, the image of a black father during slavery, whether they were demasculated, whether there's generations where the black man was dehumanized. And then laws were created to make sure for any little infraction, he was incarcerated. There's documentaries you can watch about what has happened. For whatever reason, the black man and the black father has been a target to undermine the strength of the family, and it's carried on for generation to generation. Now, there are other social factors. I'm not just blaming it on that one. But even modern day, the number of young people arrested for a minor infraction carrying marijuana that could be incarcerated and then can't even vote in some states, to me, is that there has been this generational effort to dehumanize and humiliate the black man. But then there are many examples where there are fathers. I'm a father, have been married now 30 years next year, and so there are examples, but unfortunately, black men have been a target, and a result of the instability of some of the neighborhoods they live in, there are many young people missing that father figure, that role. But this, again, I'm not a sociologist, it goes on beyond generations, but it's something that just don't blame the victim. You have to realize there were other circumstances that led up to what has happened here in the United States.
I'll give you a quick different perspective on that. Same answer, but different perspective. And basically, it goes back to your, when you opened with your comment, you need to not think of it as an individual issue. It's a systemic issue. It's a system issue. And if you look at it historically, going back to Mr. Silver's point, is that when you go back to slavery, families were separated. Men were with different owners. And so that right there is the beginning of this systemic process that then you move into, even into the early 1900s, where it basically is illegal or not allowed you to testify against a white person, almost then essentially making it legal to basically do whatever you want and kill black men. And if you fast forward some more to the 60s, now you're talking our lifetimes where everybody thought Civil Rights Act, we're done, there's no racism ended, right? It didn't. It just came in different ways through the subconscious or unconscious implicit bias. And Obama was elected. That's it. Racism is over. It clearly, the last 4 years indicated it is not. So it's a systemic issue, and that's where I think it boils down to. It's not a one-off individual person. And that's key to understanding the whole issue of racism, where, it's not an individual, it's not a person, it's a system that actually has to get addressed rather than just individual persons. Because it's really easy after the Civil Rights Act, well, I'm not racist, so I'm a good person, I'm not racist. Well, it's not you, it's a system. Bob, anybody else?
I think that's time.
I think it might be time.
I'm calling time.
Again, I want to thank Mr. Silver for his time today.
Thank you for saying, like I said, it was unplugged, but I really appreciate you all staying. And I agree, this was the hardest session I've ever done in my life. Thank you for being here to hear some of it. And like I said, the two takeaways, please remember, diversity, equity, inclusion is not something you do, it's who you are. And remember, if you want to be an ally, don't say, what can I do? First ask, how do I feel? And I think that will start the beginning of the healing and the doing process. Thank you all.
I want to thank you
Jim.
for letting me fall in love with planning again.